Now let's get into gross domestic product, GDP, probably one of the most important economic indicators that any one country can have. It's the most common measure of an economy's size. So essentially, the larger the gross domestic product is for a particular country, we can pretty much say that this country is producing a lot of goods and services. And countries do like to have a very, very high number or high value for gross domestic product because it can say that the country is doing fairly well economically. So what countries do you think nowadays have the largest GDP? It's going to be mostly developed countries. So here, the United States, they are number one in terms of GDP, roughly about $21 to $22 trillion worth of GDP. China is number two, very large country as well. It's still considered a developing country, but has a very large GDP, roughly about 15 to 16 trillion. Japan, Germany, India, they round out the top five. Japan has roughly about 5 to 6 trillion. Germany and the Indian roughly about 3 to 4 trillion. And then France and the United Kingdom also rank in the top as well. I think roughly about maybe 2 to 3 trillion for each of those countries. So as you can see right here, very, very high GDP values are what countries are going to strive for. But as we're going to see in the later half of this chapter, there are a few shortcomings just with the calculation of GDP because just the absolute value itself doesn't tell a lot about the individual standard of living for the citizens within a particular country. But for now, we're going to be a little bit interested in how we actually calculate GDP and what is going to be encapsulated under it. So if you wanted a formal definition of what GDP is, it's just a measure of the economy's total output. So let's go ahead and write down a few things. Take a look at GDP in depth. So GDP is gross domestic product. It's a measure of the economy's total output. Measure of the economy's total output. Of the economy's total output. And every single country, they have their own GDP values. And the higher this value is, it just tells us that the economy is producing a lot more goods and services. If we wanted a little bit more of a in-depth or formal definition, we can say it's equal to the total market value, equal to the total market value of all final goods and services, produced by resources in a given year. Produced by resources in a given year. So once again, GDP is equal to the total market value of all final goods and services produced by resources in a given year. So only for one particular year do we calculate out GDP for. And one key word that we want to go ahead and hone in on is going to be final goods and services. So the reason why we want to hone in on final goods and services is because if we try to include everything that we produce, we're actually going to be ending up double counting a lot of the goods and services. So here, we don't want that double counting. So we need to differentiate between final goods and intermediate goods. So final goods are exactly like the name implies. These are goods that are going to be produced or are going to be used to meet our needs and wants. They're used for consumption or investment. Essentially, we're not going to be using it to produce another good or service. So here, final goods. So final goods, as we said before, these are goods used for consumption or investment. So we can say used for consumption or investment. So here, in terms of final goods, the United States produces roughly about $21 to $22 trillion worth of final goods in 2020, 2021. So here, this is exactly final goods. So we use them for consumption and investment. They are used to satisfy needs or wants. So what do you think would be a few examples of final goods? A lot of food items come into play with final goods. So we can say maybe a Starbucks coffee. You go to Starbucks, you buy a coffee, you're going to consume that right away. That would be considered to be some type of final good. We could say, hey, why not a pizza? So here, the extra large pizza that I order for myself every Friday night because I don't get invited to parties, that would be considered to be a part of a GDP because it is considered to be a final good. I consume that entire pizza in one night. Other examples include maybe something like a car, maybe something like a book. So there are a lot of things that we just go ahead, use it right away. We don't use it in the production of another good or service. These are all things that would be included under GDP. And we need to differentiate final goods against intermediate goods. Intermediate goods. Intermediate goods are goods or services that are going to be used in the production of these final goods. So goods and services used in the eventual production, of final goods, So intermediate goods, these are things that we're actually going to be using in the production of these final goods. So here, let's go ahead and think of a few examples. So in terms of examples, in terms of maybe say the pizza that I order, it could be all the toppings that I put onto the pizza. So pepperoni, sausage, peppers, mushroom, cheese, marinara sauce. Those would all be considered to be intermediate goods, and we don't include that in our calculation of GDP, because if we did, we'd be counting the value of those goods plus the pizza, and that would actually be double counting and increasing the amount of GDP, and we don't want to do that. So we can say the toppings for the pizza, that's perfectly fine. In terms of a car, what is used in the production of a car? We can say maybe the tires, we can say the metal. This is all going to be used in the production of a car, so we don't want to include the value of these sort of things. In terms of a book, we can say maybe the binding, the paper. So all of these are considered to be intermediate goods, and we don't want to include these in the production, in the calculation of GDP. We only want to focus in on these final goods. And also in terms of GDP, the easiest way to differentiate GDP against the second measure, GNP, which we're going to take a look at very, very shortly, is to ask ourselves where this final good is actually being produced or actually being manufactured. So in terms of GDP, we also want to go ahead and say that it's going to be produced within a country's borders. So also produced by resources within a country's borders. So if it's made within the United States' borders, it is immediately going to fall under the calculation of US GDP. So anywhere in the 50 states or one of its territories. So if it's within US borders, it's US GDP. If it's produced within China's borders, it's Chinese GDP, and then so on down the line. So this is the easiest way to differentiate GDP against GNP, which we'll talk about right now. So here, GDP, just as a sort of final conclusion, it's the total market value of all final goods and services produced by resources in a given year. This is the most typical version that is produced with any news report or any research. It is something that is very, very typical for any country. However, there is a very, very closely related term that is known as gross national product, or GNP. And GNP is going to focus in on the income side just a little bit more. It's actually called gross domestic income nowadays, just to go ahead and match up with the idea just a little bit more closely. But I'm a little bit old school, so I'm going to use the old school term, gross national product. The new school term is gross domestic income. I'm going to stick with gross national product. So gross national product is the market value of all goods and services produced domestically and abroad using resources supplied by a country's citizens. So in terms of GNP, we're focused just a little bit more in terms of the citizenship of either the individual or the firm or corporation. So here, we want to go ahead and focus exactly how many goods and services our citizens, our firms and corporations can actually produce within a given year. Also, in terms of GNP, we want to exclude any foreign resources or foreign individuals. So this is something important that you should note as well. So also in terms of GNP, also include this little phrase at the end of the definition that we saw in the slides. It's also going to excludes the value of goods and services, by foreign-owned citizens. So here with GNP, we only care about the citizenship of exactly the goods and services that are being produced, the citizenship of the individuals or firms or corporations. If you are a US citizen, it's immediately going to go under US GNP. If you are a US-based firm or corporation, it goes into US GNP, and it doesn't matter where you actually produce the goods. If you are a US citizen and you make a good in, say, China or in Japan, it would fall under US GNP. If you are a US company or corporation and you do business overseas, you produce a good in a foreign country, still that would be considered US GNP. So here you want to be a little bit careful about exactly GNP and GDP, because even though they sound very similar, they are going to be calculated in a very different manner. So GDP, we care about exactly where it's being produced within the borders, and GNP, we care a little bit more about the citizenship of the individuals or firms and corporations. The calculation of GNP and GDP is actually very, very close to one another. The difference is actually pretty negligible. But there are differences between the two, which is why we sort of want to talk about the differentiation and similarities right here. So here, we do focus a little bit more on GDP, but we can also use GNP kind of interchangeably because the values and calculations are pretty close, but we just want to go ahead and take a closer look at these two sort of measures, because in any research or any terms of in any news reports that you see, they tend to use these kind of interchangeably with one another. In the next video, I'll give you a few examples to make sure that you guys understand the differentiation between GDP and GNP, just so you guys get a clearer idea between these two measures.